You pierce my soul. I'm half agony, half hope. Tell me that I am not too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever. This is the message that permeates modern society today, and the discourse surrounding classic novels, if you should read classic novels, the worth in reading, and I wanted to talk about that today. I also wanted to talk about the continued resonance of classic novels with modern audiences, and also the kind of anti-classics or anti-intellectualism that we see on TikTok and Twitter and other spaces like that. If you don't know who I am, my name is Imogen. I make bookish content on the internet. I have a TikTok page, and I am a massive reader. I am a lover of classics, and I feel qualified to talk about this because I read about 150 books a year, and of those 150, I'd say around 40 to 50 of them are some sort of classic literature, whether that be science fiction, fantasy, or romance or fiction. So yeah, I do love classics and I love to talk about them and I love to read them. Some of my favorite classics are Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, of Clarice Lispector's An Apprenticeship or The Book of Pleasures. Hello, this is editing Imogen from the future, realizing that I'm a dingus because I didn't talk about one of my favorite books of all time, Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And I love Carmilla. I love lesbians, I love vampires, and I love classic literature. So it's like my favorite three things rolled up into one. So that's one of my favorite books as well. Just felt like I had to share that because it's really important to me personally. So yeah, I'm a big classics person and I'm really excited to be able to talk about them right now. Now, a classic novel can be anything, in my opinion. I think, if there's a modern classic, if there's a vintage classic, if it's got the name classic slapped on it, like it's basically a classic, according to publishing standards anyway. The classic novel is kind of much debated, especially in spaces such as TikTok and Twitter and other online spaces, because discourse always surrounds these texts. So for me, I think if something was written before the 80s and it's more than 40 years old and it's still being published and it still kind of stood the test of time, we can start considering it a modern classic. Examples of this I'd think would be like Lord of the Rings, which is obviously a staple of modern fantasy, and classic fantasy as well, because it was written in the 50s. The Hobbit came out in 1937 or 1936. And these texts have influenced modern fantasy writing so much that they're basically essential to the average person's literary canon. Obviously, any text written in the 1800s, people consider to be a classic because it has survived 100 plus years, which obviously makes you think about how many people have been reading it and enjoying it enough that it's still being published today. But publishing in itself has always been this kind of classist or impenetrable force where only a certain kind of person could be published, until, more recent history. So I think generally speaking, the definition of a classic has to be fluid. It can't be this black and white thing, because once you start putting barriers on things like that, you are really limiting queer people, people of color, and their stories, and stories of those ages that came out of unrest amongst those groups. You're limiting their consideration in the world of a classic. Just because it may have been written more recently doesn't mean it shouldn't be considered as essential to our literary canon or our literary world around us. The idea of something classical and the 19th century romantic entanglement it really pervades current society. I mean, we see it in things like Bridgerton and the revamp of the Regency. I think Jane Austen, specifically her works, will always be relevant, at least in the kind of future that we're heading towards, because love stories are always relevant. People always want to read about love, and when you're reading about an experience so far removed from your own, I think people really want to entertain that and they want to read it. That being said, a lot of people are going towards this more anti-classic stance, where you'll see often on TikTok, because, Booktok is such an essential part of the current way that publishing governs. You'll see people talking about, you don't have to read classics, you don't have to do anything. And let me be clear, you don't have to do anything. This video is not me trying to get you on the classics train, but more trying to discuss the value of a classic in someone's life and the value of classics overall to literature. A lot of classics, especially the older ones, they are kind of easy money for publishing to make. They don't really have to pay copyright on them because they've been in the public domain for more than 100 years. So, sorry, my dog is snoring next to me. I don't know if you can hear it, but yeah, so if they've been in the public domain for more than 100 years, you don't have to pay copyright on them. Anyone, like the publishers can publish them and make lots of money off them. And we used to see, not so much anymore, I mean, at least in Australia, but we used to see lots of publishers having classics at very low price points because that made it accessible for anyone to read. And a classic was considered to be something that anyone should read or everyone could read. And that's something we'll talk about later. But, more and more these days, we're seeing classics kind of popping up at like the $22.99 price point in Australian dollars, which I'd say is probably like 12 pounds and maybe about like $16. I think if I'm getting my estimations right, I'll put the exact one on the screen. But this form of like escapist media is always prevalent, and I think the older classics are really, really popular for that reason. The Jane Austens, the Brontes, those kind of classics, even like the Russians. Dostoevsky is a really interesting one. There's a trend on TikTok at the moment where it'll say something along the lines of you can learn a lot about someone based on the books that they see themselves in. And I often see like the picture of Dorian Gray and Dostoevsky, like Crime and Punishment, Catcher in the Rye. And I understand that people are trying to make the point that they're like unlikable, they're three-dimensional. At the same time, you are quite different from the main character of Crime and Punishment, Raznolikov, because you're not being sent to a gulag. And that's why people can see themselves in it, because it is this escapist media. Even though the world you're escaping into might not be the best, and probably you would not be very happy there, it still serves as a form of escapism and as a form of being able to let yourself run wild and your imagination run wild. I think a really good example of this is Emma 2020, the film. The film was very popular. The costuming was very popular because lots of people saw it to be more accurate than some other Austen adaptations. Cough, cough, Pride and Prejudice 2005. We don't speak of it. And I think that movie really encapsulates this like very romantic and like flowery version of the 1800s aesthetic, which is not even a sentence I ever thought I'd say, but it does. And that's why people love it so much, because it is so far removed from their lives that they can escape into it. The central themes of Austen's works, which are themes that we still relate to now, are love and friendship and what is right for the main characters, but also what is right for the people around them. And all of Austen's works discuss those things, and those are still things that people are considering and questioning about themselves now. And if people can find something worthwhile and find a message that they relate strongly to or they believe helps them in any way, then why shouldn't the classic be relevant to them? Why shouldn't it be their favorite? Film adaptations of classics are also massively popular. The 2022 Persuasion adaptation, while terrible and critically panned, it was produced, Dakota Johnson was starring, because there is a general desire for this aesthetic of the 1800s romance. And another example, I think, is a book like Mrs. Dalloway, which really encourages escapism. There's a lot of imagination and daydreaming Mrs. Dalloway and speculation on the characters' lives. And while I don't want to talk too much about tropes and the tropification of the Booktok world, generally speaking, a book is popular due to the fact of the ingredients of that book. What makes the book so widespread, what makes the book so approachable. So Mrs. Dalloway has this young girl who is on this day-long journey, and ultimately the essential elements of that are what makes the book like readable for people to read, and they want to read it. It's because of these elements and these tropes. Lots of people have been discussing the fast fashion implication of Booktok at the moment, and I'll link some videos for you to watch if you'd like to know more about that. But it's a really interesting conversation surrounding the mass production of books and the overconsumption of books. And I think a classic novel is kind of the antithesis of this. A classic novel is something that you can find in a charity shop, find in a bookstore, used bookstore, and read and consume in the same way that the person who bought the original copy did. But a classic also lends itself to being reproduced over and over in different ways. And I'll show you a really great example of that I have in my room with me now. So I first read Frankenstein when I was in year 12 for the HSC, and I read a Penguin's Orange Classics edition, very recognizable edition of the book. The edition that I currently own is this edition. This is published by Alma Books, which is a British publishing company. I mean, it's a really fantastic cover. The edition itself is pretty thin, which I personally like in a classic. I like them to be a bit sleeker so I can fit more on my shelves. And then in contrast to my other edition of Frankenstein, which is the Penguin Classics Deluxe edition, this one has this comic style. It's got these like old pop arty style things. I'll show you the back cover as well. These reproductions lend themselves to being collected. I fucking love these reproductions. I have the Master and Margarita in this edition as well. And, you know, even just things down to the deckled edges, they just make you want to buy them and collect them and consume them. So while classic novels are easily accessible and widely available, they do still lend themselves to being overconsumed and maybe contributing, whether inadvertently or advertently by publishers, to this fast fashionification of TikTok as we're seeing and hearing about now. Everybody knows that the publishing industry was dying and bookstores were closing down like at a rapid rate before BookTube and Booktok really took off. And obviously we do, you know, owe a lot to that. But I think the question of it now is it getting to a point where anything can be published? And obviously the answer to that is no, because not anything can be published. Maybe a romance novel written by a white woman who's already written quite a few other books, cough, cough, Tessa Bailey, might be able to be published. And lots of people may not feel that that is up to the same standard as romance novels used to be. But at the same time, we're no longer seeing the romance novels of, you know, yesteryear, because they do go out of print and things, you know, they fluctuate. The things that are popular now being this like Tessa Bailey style illustrated cover romance wasn't the thing that was popular in the 90s when bodice rippers were massive and being mass produced, and the mass market paperback was rife, like it was in every bookstore. The other point to consider on a classic is if it is being published and marketed as a classic, you find it in the classic section of a bookstore, does that make it easier for the book to be consumed? So if something was released in the 90s and it now comes in the format of a Penguin Orange Classics edition, it is automatically reputable. It is automatically given something behind it that may make people consider it and read it and consume it in a way that they may not have before, because it's got this basis of this reputation of being an orange classic that is something so widely beloved by people. And I think a really great example of this is The Secret History. Now, I love The Secret History by Donna Tartt. It's a fantastic book in my opinion, obviously not without some faults, but generally speaking, I think it's a very well done book. And it was first released in 1992, so only 32 years ago. But it does come in the Orange Classics edition. And, you know, if we're thinking about other books that were published in 1992 to 96, let's say, a great example that comes to my mind is Stardust by Neil Gaiman, finished in 1996. Now, do you consider Stardust by Neil Gaiman a classic? Not necessarily, because it doesn't come in a classic format. It isn't given to us, and our eyes don't see it and perceive it as a classic, purely for the fact that when you walk into a bookstore, it's not shelved with classics, it's shelved with fantasy. And classics, generally speaking, only pertain to fiction. So when you go into a bookstore and you go and look at the classic section, are you only seeing classical fiction, or are you seeing classical romance? Are you seeing classical sci-fi? So a great example of this is the book A Voyage to Arcturus, and I have a copy of this book, but I did not see it in the classic section. I saw it in the fantasy section, and I was like, wow, this book's crazy. It came out in like the 30s. It's kind of got this pre-Dune vibe to it. It's got tentacles and space opera, and it's a fantastic read. It is incredibly slow, but it is a great read. And so for me, reading that, even though I know, you know, I'm reading a fantasy novel, the way that this book approaches the fantasy element is so like 1930s vibes. Like it's amazing to read something that was written in a time so different from my own, and about 90 years ago, where the people living 90 years ago didn't know the things that I know, but they can still write a book that communicates such an integral message to me. But can this go too far when we are talking about classics and only reading classics? People who had access to books and reading and this information, it was only the rich people or the people who had time to sit down and read, not the people who had to work, the middle class. So the elitism that we see online, especially surrounding classics and maybe even if I was to go so far as to say the dark academia genre, you often see people being like, I only study the Greeks. I only study classic literature written before 1900. And it's giving very much, I refuse to understand things that are going on now. You can read a book that was written now and it can be just as serving to you, and it can be just as memorable and provide a message to you than a book written in 1900 does. There's nothing wrong with learning about the past and learning about history. I love history and I want to learn about the past as much as I can. But at the same time, you don't need to approach it from a standpoint of people who only read romance novels are dumb, because ultimately that is rooted in misogyny. You need to unpack that for yourself. That's not my job here today. Whilst I kind of understand the, appeal of that, something so different from your life, but it's giving very much I was born in the wrong generation. Reading classics and approaching content creation through this lens of only reading classics and only talking about classics and relying overly on the aesthetic of a classic also limits the dissemination of the information. It limits the spread of your message of classics elitism, because you're limiting who can engage in them, which obviously is the ultimate point. So why should we read classics? Classics have prevailed for a reason. There's a reason they have stuck around. There's a multitude of reasons. One of those reasons definitely is the way that publishing used to be. It used to be a lot more inaccessible and not as easily penetrated by people who are people of color, queer people, and stories that were different to the ones already being told. A great example of this is Carol, or The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith. Initially, when it was published, Patricia Highsmith published it under a different name because she didn't want to publish her lesbian love story and possibly be blacklisted from the industry, because it was still in the days of the criminalization of homosexuality. So it's only later on in her life she's been able to put her name on that work that she obviously put so much time and emotion into. So Carol now is a classic. It is a classic of lesbian literature. It's a classic of fiction. And I think a book that lots of people I think everyone should read. But when it first came out, it was, it wasn't able to shine in the way that it should have. And I think a lot of classics have that, where they had this kind of underdog mentality, and now they're super popular and people love them. But at the time, the authors were criticized or jailed in the case of Oscar Wilde and things like that. So a classic can provide to you something that a book being published today can't. I think ultimately that's why we should be reading classics, because whilst it is fun to read something that was written by someone that you can engage with right now, I can go on Goodreads and follow an author on Goodreads and engage with their life and engage with their writing. I can also have a glimpse into the past and see how someone, or maybe a young queer person like myself, was living. And I think it's a really beautiful thing that we are able to see these things. It's like seeing an old photograph, but you're seeing someone's innermost thoughts bared out on the page in front of you. In order for that to come across, people do need to like the book, and the book needs to stay and stick around in society, and it needs to prevail. Things that do prevail are the kind of essential human experiences, love and loss and grief and hope and agony. And ultimately, that's why these books stick around. So you don't have to read classics if you don't want to. And you also shouldn't limit yourself to only reading classics, because life is full of nuance, and life is never going to be exactly the way that we perceive it and want it to go. James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room is a fantastic example of this, because it has all of the essential ingredients of what I consider to be a classic, something that has these themes that will last forever and ever and ever, as long as humans last. It also was underappreciated because of a multitude of reasons, but racism and homophobia at the time. And it's amazing that it can shine in this way and be loved in this way by people of today. So I think you should read widely and cast your net out as far as you can and be able to entertain all kinds of stories and people. Make a concerted effort to be reading outside of your own experiences and be reading things that you may not have ever heard about before. Ultimately, we should be holding on to the fact that information is so widely accessible to us, and we are lucky that we can go to a bookstore and read a queer love story written by a black man. And so why should you read classics? Ultimately, I can't tell you what to do. I can't tell you should read classics. I can't tell you shouldn't. But I think you're limiting yourself by not reading classics, and I think you're limiting yourself by only reading classics. I hope you liked this kind of content. It's a little bit of a different video than I usually do, but I just felt really passionate about it. I've made a couple of TikToks on this topic before, what makes a classic, and I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about. So yeah, if you liked it, let me know. If you didn't, let me know as well, and I hope you're having an absolutely gorgeous day. Mwah.